The shock was not only physical, but cultural. These women had been raised in a system that stripped them of individuality. They were auxiliaries, functionaries, pieces of the Great War Machine. Their comfort did not matter. Their suffering was proof of devotion. And yet here, in the hands of their supposed foes, they were treated as individuals. Nurse Keiko Tanaka had prepared herself for death. The transport ship groaned beneath her feet as American destroyers closed in, their guns trained on the vessel, carrying wounded Japanese personnel back from the Pacific Theater. She pressed her medical kit against her chest, the metal instruments cold through the canvas. Around her, 17 other women huddled in the cargo hold, their faces pale with terror and resignation. They had been told what capture meant. The Americans were devils who tortured prisoners for sport, who violated women and left them to die in filth. Better to leap into the ocean than face such dishonor. Keiko touched the small blade hidden in her sleeve, a final mercy if the stories proved true. The ship shuddered as enemy fire found its mark. Metal screamed against metal, and the deck tilted sharply starboard. Water rushed through the hull with a sound like thunder. The women gripped each other, whispering prayers to ancestors they would soon join. But death came not as expected. Strong hands pulled Keiko from the wreckage, hauling her onto a landing craft where American soldiers worked frantically to save survivors. She waited for the blow, the rough treatment, the beginning of horrors. Instead, a young medic pressed a blanket around her shoulders and checked her injuries with gentle efficiency. The prison camp at Stockton appeared through morning fog like a vision from another world. Neat rows of wooden barracks stretched across a valley floor, surrounded by wire, but somehow lacking the menace Keiko had imagined. Guards stood at attention, their weapons present but not threatening. The air smelled of cooking food rather than death. Processing was swift and bewildering. Names were recorded, not erased. Medical examinations were thorough but respectful. Keiko found herself assigned to Barrack 7, led there by a guard who spoke broken Japanese phrases of reassurance. She clutched her medical kit, the only possession they had allowed her to keep. The barracks door swung open to reveal rows of narrow beds, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, and folded blankets. 17 other women sat or stood in various states of confusion, their eyes wide with the same disbelief that gripped Keiko. This was not the hell they had been promised. An older woman named Sachiko approached with trembling steps. She had been captured 3 days earlier near Saipan. Her transport sunk while evacuating wounded officers. Her whispered words carried the weight of impossible revelation. They give us food 3 times each day. Clean water whenever we ask. They have not struck anyone. Keiko sank onto the assigned bed, her medical training struggling to process what her eyes witnessed. The mattress yielded beneath her weight, soft and clean. The blanket was thick wool, dyed navy blue, warm against her fingertips. These were not the accommodations of the condemned. The first night passed in restless confusion. Keiko lay beneath the navy wool blanket, her body tense with expectation. Surely the kindness was temporary, a cruel prelude to horrors yet to come. Around her, the other women breathed quietly in the darkness, none daring to speak their bewilderment aloud. At dawn, no harsh whistles pierced the air. No boots thundered across wooden floors demanding immediate assembly. Instead, a gentle knock came at the barracks door, followed by a guard speaking careful Japanese words. "Breakfast time. Please come when ready." The mess hall stretched before them like a mirage. Long wooden tables filled with American soldiers eating alongside other prisoners from different barracks. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the air, rich and impossible. Keiko had not tasted coffee in 2 years, not since rationing had reduced civilians to bitter substitutes made from acorns and chicory. A server, an American private with kind eyes, ladled scrambled eggs onto her metal tray. Real eggs, not the powdered substitute she remembered from Yokohama. Beside them, strips of bacon glistened with fat, and thick slices of white bread waited for butter. Her hands trembled as she carried the tray to an empty table. Sachiko sat beside her, staring at the abundance with tears forming. In Tokyo, her children survived on rice mixed with sawdust to stretch the meager rations. Here, in this prison, food covered the entire plate. The contradiction was too vast to comprehend. How could captivity offer more sustenance than freedom had provided? The bacon was salty and rich, the eggs creamy and warm. Each bite delivered flavors that had vanished from Japanese tables as the war consumed everything. Keiko ate slowly, certain the feast would be snatched away, revealed as elaborate torture. But the guards merely refilled coffee cups and cleared empty plates with routine efficiency. Other prisoners spoke in hushed tones, sharing fragments of their capture stories. A radio operator named Yuki had been pulled from a burning communications bunker near Guam. A supply clerk called Emiko had survived a torpedo strike while transporting medical supplies. Each woman carried the same expression of stunned disbelief. After breakfast, they were assigned simple tasks. Keiko found herself in the camp infirmary, her medical training recognized and respected rather than dismissed. The American doctor, Captain Morrison, spoke to her in halting Japanese, asking about her experience with battlefield wounds. He listened carefully to her responses, taking notes as if her knowledge mattered. The infirmary was clean and well-stocked, better equipped than most Japanese field hospitals she had known. Bandages, antiseptics, and pain medications filled the supply cabinets in quantities that would have seemed impossible back home. Captain Morrison demonstrated new wound cleaning techniques, treating her as a colleague rather than a captive. At midday, another meal arrived. Soup made with real vegetables, bread that was soft and fresh, milk that was cold and pure. Keiko counted the portions automatically, her mind calculating how many Japanese civilians could be fed with what she consumed in a single day. The mathematics of survival had become reversed in this strange place. By the third day, the impossible had become routine. Keiko woke to sunlight streaming through clean windows rather than the harsh clang of metal on metal. The morning ritual of abundant breakfast no longer shocked her empty stomach, though her mind still reeled at the contradiction. In the infirmary, Captain Morrison continued treating her as a valued colleague, asking her opinions on patient care and listening to her responses with genuine interest. The other women began to speak more freely during meals. Yuki, the radio operator, described her amazement at being given a comb and mirror. In the Japanese military, such vanity was forbidden, personal appearance irrelevant, except as it served the empire. Here, the Americans seemed to believe that dignity included the right to care for oneself. Emiko, the supply clerk, had been issued new undergarments when hers were damaged in the torpedo attack. Clean, properly fitting clothes that no one would ever see, yet somehow mattered. Sachiko received a letter-writing kit during the afternoon. Paper, pencil, and an envelope with instructions in careful Japanese explaining that she could write to her family. The guard who delivered it smiled awkwardly and pointed to the address format, trying to help her understand the unfamiliar postal system. Sachiko stared at the blank paper for an hour, unable to reconcile the kindness with everything she had been taught about American cruelty. In the infirmary, Keiko worked alongside American medics who treated her with the same respect they showed each other. They taught her new techniques for treating burns, shared coffee during breaks, and asked about her family with genuine concern. One young corpsman, named Davis, showed her photographs of his wife and daughter, speaking of them with tenderness that contradicted every propaganda image of heartless American soldiers. The evening brought another revelation. After dinner, the prisoners were led to a recreation hall where books lined wooden shelves and musical instruments waited on small tables. A piano stood in one corner, its keys worn smooth by countless fingers. Several American soldiers sat reading newspapers or playing checkers, their weapons set aside, their postures relaxed and unthreatening. Yuki approached the piano with trembling hands. She had studied music as a child before the war consumed such luxuries. Her fingers found the keys tentatively, pressing out a simple melody that filled the room with unexpected beauty. The Americans looked up from their activities, listening with appreciation rather than suspicion. One soldier began humming along, his voice joining the delicate notes in harmony. Keiko selected a book from the shelf, its pages printed in Japanese characters that spoke of home. The story was a simple tale of a fisherman and his daughter, nothing political or dangerous, just human emotions and family bonds. She had not read for pleasure in years, every text having been filtered through military necessity. Here, literature existed simply to bring comfort and escape. As the evening progressed, the boundaries between captor and prisoner began to blur. Americans and Japanese sat together at tables, playing simple games that required no common language. Laughter emerged tentatively at first, then more freely as the artificial barriers of war dissolved in the warmth of shared humanity. When lights dimmed and the women returned to their barracks, Keiko carried with her a profound sense of displacement. This was not prison as she understood it. These were not enemies as she had been taught to recognize them. Each kindness was a crack in the foundation of everything she had believed about this war and her place within it. The transformation deepened as days blurred into weeks. Keiko's work in the infirmary had become a source of unexpected fulfillment. Captain Morrison trusted her judgment completely now, often deferring to her experience with tropical diseases that American medics had never encountered. When a prisoner arrived with symptoms she recognized from her service in the Philippines, her diagnosis saved the man's life. Morrison shook her hand afterward, his gratitude genuine and unguarded. Sachiko finally completed her letter home. The words had come slowly, each sentence a struggle against disbelief. How could she tell her children in Tokyo that their mother was safer in an enemy prison than they were in their own city? That she ate meat daily while they survived on watery rice? That her captors treated her wounds while her own government had sent her to die without adequate medical supplies? The letter would travel through military censors who would read her impossible testimony. American kindness documented in careful Japanese characters, signed with her real name rather than a prisoner number. The contradiction would trouble intelligence officials who had built their strategies on assumptions of American brutality that these letters systematically contradicted. Yuki had become the unofficial camp musician, her piano playing drawing audiences of both prisoners and guards. American soldiers would request songs from home, humming melodies that reminded them of wives and mothers thousands of miles away. In return, she played traditional Japanese pieces that spoke of cherry blossoms and mountain streams, music that transcended the boundaries of war. The most startling change came in the way they carried themselves. Keiko noticed at first in the mirror Captain Morrison had hung in the infirmary. Her reflection showed a woman standing straight, meeting her own eyes without shame. In the Japanese military, she had learned to make herself invisible, to move through spaces without drawing attention. Here, she walked with purpose and dignity. Emiko had begun teaching English to other prisoners, using vocabulary cards that guards had provided. The Americans seemed eager to communicate beyond basic commands, sharing stories of their hometowns and families. Corpsman Davis showed photographs of his daughter's first steps, his pride evident despite the language barrier. These men spoke of missing their children, of wanting to return home to peaceful lives. The contradiction grew more painful with each passing day. Intelligence reports filtered into the camp described the treatment of Allied prisoners in Japanese facilities. Starvation, disease, forced labor that killed 1 in 3 captured Americans. The systematic brutality that military doctrine demanded toward enemies who refused to surrender with honor. Yet here, Japanese women gained weight, learned new skills, and discovered aspects of themselves that military service had suppressed. Keiko found herself thinking in ways that would have been treasonous months earlier. If Americans could treat enemies with dignity, what did that say about her own nation's methods? If captivity could nurture growth rather than destroy it, what did that mean about freedom? The evening recreation period had become a sanctuary where artificial boundaries dissolved completely. Americans and Japanese worked together on jigsaw puzzles, their hands touching as they fitted pieces into place. Language barriers fell away as they communicated through gestures and laughter, building connections that transcended the divisions of war. As Keiko prepared for sleep, pulling the navy wool blanket around her shoulders, she realized that shame had been replaced by something far more dangerous. Hope. Hope that the world could be different than she had been taught. Hope that enemies could choose mercy over vengeance. Hope that her own worth extended beyond her usefulness to the empire that had discarded her so easily. The letters began flowing more freely as weeks passed. Sachiko had received a reply from her family in Tokyo, the thin paper trembling in her hands as she read words of disbelief and confusion. Her son wrote that neighbors whispered about her shame, but his own words carried relief that she was alive. Her daughter begged for details about American treatment, unable to reconcile propaganda with her mother's descriptions of daily abundance. Keiko composed her own letter with careful deliberation. Each word was weighed against the knowledge that military censors on both sides would scrutinize every character. She wrote to her sister in Nagoya about the medical work, the respect shown for her knowledge, the way Captain Morrison consulted her as an equal colleague. She described the well-stocked infirmary, the clean bandages, the pain medications that were abundant rather than hoarded. These testimonies created ripples of confusion through intelligence networks. Japanese officials reading intercepted letters found systematic contradictions to their own propaganda. How could enemy prisons offer better conditions than Japanese cities? How could captivity provide more dignity than military service? The mathematics of suffering had been reversed in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about American character. Yuki received permission to write to her former radio instructor, a stern woman who had trained operators for Pacific theater deployment. Her letter described the recreation hall, the piano, the evening gatherings where Americans and Japanese played games together. She wrote about learning English phrases, about guards who shared photographs of their families, about the gradual dissolution of fear that had defined her military experience. The camp's mail system operated with efficiency that amazed the prisoners. Letters reached Japan within weeks. Responses returned almost as quickly. American postal workers handled correspondence from enemy prisoners with the same care they showed letters from their own soldiers. The humanity of the system contrasted sharply with the brutal simplicity they had expected from captivity. Emiko's letters to her parents in Osaka painted pictures of daily life that read like fiction to those who received them. 3 meals daily, medical care when needed, educational opportunities, even small luxuries like soap and toothbrushes. Her father wrote back asking if she was being forced to lie, unable to believe that enemies would provide such treatment without extracting terrible prices in return. In the infirmary, Keiko witnessed American doctors treating wounded Japanese soldiers with the same care they provided their own forces. No distinction was made between friend and enemy when human suffering required relief. Captain Morrison explained medical procedures to her with patience and respect, seeking her input on cases where her tropical disease experience exceeded his own knowledge. The most troubling revelations came through official channels that prisoners were not meant to see. Reports of Allied prison camps in Japanese territory described systematic starvation, disease, and death rates that approached 30%. The contrast with their own experience created cognitive dissonance that some prisoners could not resolve. Several women struggled with guilt that their comfort came while their countrymen suffered. Others questioned whether their treatment represented American weakness or strength. Keiko found herself torn between gratitude for kindness received and shame that enemies showed more concern for her welfare than her own commanders had demonstrated. The evening recreation periods continued to serve as spaces where artificial boundaries collapsed. Americans taught card games. Japanese women shared origami techniques. Laughter echoed through the hall as guards and prisoners collaborated on crossword puzzles, their different languages creating amusing misunderstandings that brought people together rather than driving them apart. As Keiko sealed another letter to her sister, she realized that her words were becoming weapons against the very system that had shaped her. Each description of American kindness undermined propaganda that depended on hatred for its power. Her testimony, multiplied by dozens of other voices, was creating cracks in the foundation of beliefs that sustained the war effort. Beauty began appearing in unexpected places throughout the Stockton camp. Guards had strung lights around the recreation hall for no purpose other than creating warmth against the evening darkness. Someone had planted flowers along the walkways between barracks, their bright colors serving no military function, existing solely to please the eye. These small touches contradicted everything the women had learned about enemy psychology. Yuki's evening piano concerts had evolved into collaborative performances. American soldiers brought harmonicas and guitars, creating impromptu ensembles that blended musical traditions across cultural boundaries. The melodies were often clumsy, languages mixing in awkward harmony, yet the joy was unmistakable. Music existed here for beauty alone, not as background for marching or ceremony. Keiko discovered a small library that Captain Morrison had assembled in a corner of the infirmary. Medical texts shared shelf space with poetry collections and novels translated into Japanese. During quiet moments between patients, she found herself reading verses that spoke of love and loss rather than duty and sacrifice. Literature that acknowledged human emotions beyond service to the state. The camp's art supplies appeared without explanation or restriction. Watercolors, brushes, sketch pads distributed to anyone who showed interest. Sachiko, who had drawn architectural plans before the war, began painting landscapes visible through the barracks windows. Rolling hills and distant mountains rendered in delicate washes of color that captured peace rather than strategic positions. Evening walks were permitted within the camp boundaries, groups of women strolling together as guards maintained respectful distances. These conversations ranged freely across topics that would have been forbidden in military service. Personal dreams, family memories, observations about American customs that puzzled and intrigued them. Speech itself had become a form of recreation rather than a tool for conveying orders. Emiko organized language exchange sessions where prisoners taught Japanese while guards shared English. These gatherings dissolved into cultural exchanges that went far beyond vocabulary. Americans demonstrated baseball rules using improvised equipment, while Japanese women explained traditional games that required only stones and imagination. Understanding flowed both directions, creating connections that transcended the artificial divisions of war. The most profound change came in their relationship with time itself. Military service had divided days into rigid segments of duty, each moment accounted for and directed toward strategic objectives. Here, time existed for reflection, for conversation, for the simple pleasure of watching clouds move across sky. Hours could be spent on activities that served no purpose beyond personal satisfaction. Captain Morrison encouraged Keiko to pursue medical research that interested her personally rather than serving immediate military needs. Her studies of tropical diseases had revealed patterns that might benefit civilian populations after the war ended. The idea that her knowledge could heal rather than simply patch wounds for return to combat represented a fundamental shift in her understanding of medicine's purpose. The camp's workshop offered tools and materials for creating objects of personal meaning. Women carved small sculptures, wove baskets, crafted jewelry from available materials. These creations would never contribute to war production, would never advance strategic objectives, yet their making filled empty spaces in souls that military service had hollowed out. Religious observance occurred without compulsion or restriction. Some prisoners constructed small shrines using stones and scraps of wood, expecting immediate destruction by guards who instead simply nodded and continued their rounds. Others attended Christian services led by chaplains who offered comfort without demanding conversion. Choice itself had become revolutionary after years of commanded devotion. As darkness settled over Stockton, Keiko sat by her window watching stars appear in clear skies. The beauty above existed independent of human conflict, indifferent to the artificial boundaries that divided nations. Her fingers traced patterns on the glass, while her mind wrestled with questions that had no simple answers about the nature of humanity and the possibility of peace. The garden project began with a simple gesture. A guard approached Keiko one morning carrying a small packet of vegetable seeds and pointed toward a patch of empty ground behind the infirmary. His broken Japanese conveyed the basic message: grow something. To a woman trained to heal wounds and dispense medicine, the concept of coaxing life from soil felt alien, yet deeply compelling. Sachiko joined the effort, her architect's eye surveying the space and envisioning rows of plants that would transform bare earth into something purposeful. Together, they broke ground with borrowed tools, their hands working soil that would nurture rather than conceal defensive positions. The physical labor carried meditative qualities absent from military duties that served destruction rather than creation. Other prisoners gravitated toward the growing project. Yuki contributed knowledge from her family's rice farm, explaining drainage techniques that would prevent root rot in the valley's clay soil. Emiko shared memories of her grandmother's vegetable plots, wisdom passed down through generations that valued sustainability over rapid exploitation. Their collective knowledge represented centuries of agricultural tradition applied to this small American space. Captain Morrison provided additional seeds from the camp's supply depot, explaining that fresh vegetables would supplement the prisoners' diet while teaching practical skills for post-war survival. His enthusiasm for the project surprised Keiko, who had never seen American officers express interest in activities that produced no immediate military advantage. The daily routine expanded to include morning garden inspections. Women checked seedlings for signs of growth, discussed watering schedules, debated optimal spacing for maximum yield. These conversations carried the same intensity they had once reserved for military briefings, yet focused on nurturing life rather than calculating casualties. Progress appeared gradually. Green shoots emerging from dark soil, leaves unfurling towards sunlight, roots spreading beneath the surface in patterns invisible yet essential. The metaphor was impossible to ignore. Growth occurred in darkness, in hidden spaces, through patient tending rather than aggressive intervention. These lessons contradicted everything military training had emphasized about achieving objectives through force and speed. American guards began stopping to observe the garden's development, offering suggestions based on their own farming backgrounds. Corpsman Davis shared techniques his father had used in Iowa cornfields. Another soldier demonstrated pruning methods that would encourage stronger plant growth. Knowledge flowed freely across the boundaries that were supposed to separate captors from prisoners. Harvest time brought revelations about abundance and sharing. The vegetables they had grown exceeded immediate consumption needs, creating surplus that required distribution decisions. Rather than hoarding resources or establishing hierarchies, the women developed systems for sharing that ensured everyone received benefits regardless of their contribution level. Cooperation replaced competition as the organizing principle. Keiko found herself thinking differently about time and investment. Military service had emphasized immediate results, rapid deployment, explosive action that produced swift outcomes. Gardening required patience, consistent attention, faith that small daily efforts would eventually yield meaningful results. The contrast challenged her assumptions about effective action and sustainable progress. The most profound shift occurred in their relationship with the earth itself. Military training had taught them to view landscape as tactical terrain, valuable only for its strategic advantages or defensive potential. Here they learned to appreciate soil quality, moisture retention, seasonal rhythms that operated according to natural laws rather than human commands. Evening conversations increasingly focused on plans for post-war gardens. Women shared dreams of growing flowers alongside vegetables, of creating spaces where beauty and utility coexisted without conflict. These visions assumed futures beyond captivity, beyond war, beyond the limited horizons that military service had imposed on their imaginations. As autumn approached and the garden prepared for dormancy, Keiko understood that they had cultivated more than vegetables. They had grown connections to each other, to the land, to possibilities that transcended the artificial boundaries of conflict. Seeds planted in prison soil had produced harvests of hope that would outlive the war itself. The shrine appeared gradually, almost apologetically, in a corner of the recreation hall. Sachiko and two other women arranged small stones and scraps of wood into patterns that honored their ancestors without drawing attention to themselves. They expected immediate destruction, prepared for punishment that would confirm American intolerance for Japanese spiritual practices. Instead, guards simply nodded and continued their rounds as if personal devotion required no explanation or justification. The permission was startling. To practice faith without scrutiny felt like breathing after years underwater. Military service had demanded worship of the emperor and state, leaving no space for private spiritual relationships that served individual rather than collective needs. Here, religious expression became a matter of personal choice rather than commanded obligation. Yuki began attending evening Christian services led by Chaplain Brooks, drawn not by conversion, but by curiosity about faith traditions that emphasize forgiveness over vengeance. The chaplain welcomed her presence without demanding commitment, offering comfort through gentle words that carried no force or ultimatum. Choice itself had become foreign after years of prescribed devotion that allowed no alternatives. Keiko found herself drawn to meditation practices that Captain Morrison had described during their work together in the infirmary. His explanation of contemplative techniques for managing stress had revealed spiritual dimensions to medical practice that Japanese training had never acknowledged. The idea that healing could encompass soul as well as body represented a fundamental expansion of her professional understanding. The diversity of spiritual practices within Stockton created unexpected harmony rather than conflict. Buddhist meditation coexisted peacefully with Christian prayer, Shinto rituals sharing space with secular reflection. Guards respected all forms of spiritual expression equally, treating each tradition as valuable rather than threatening. Religious freedom operated without hierarchy or competition for legitimacy. Evening gatherings evolved to include discussions of spiritual questions that transcended cultural boundaries. What did forgiveness mean in the context of war? How could compassion survive systematic violence? Whether redemption was possible for those who had participated in destruction. These conversations carried weight that purely tactical discussions had never achieved. Emiko organized interfaith exchanges where prisoners explained Japanese spiritual traditions while guards shared their own religious backgrounds. These sessions revealed common themes across different faiths: concern for suffering, hope for peace, belief in human dignity that transcended political divisions. Understanding deepened as artificial barriers dissolved through honest conversation. The most revolutionary aspect was the absence of compulsion. No one was required to adopt any particular spiritual practice or abandon existing beliefs. Faith became a personal matter rather than a tool for social control. Women could explore questions of meaning and purpose without fear that wrong answers would result in punishment or disgrace. Chaplain Brooks encouraged questions that challenged easy answers, creating space for doubt and uncertainty that military training had never permitted. His approach to faith emphasized personal relationship rather than institutional authority, individual conscience rather than collective compliance. These concepts contradicted everything the women had learned about proper spiritual practice. Religious observance occurred according to internal rhythms rather than external schedules. Prayer happened when needed, meditation when helpful, worship when meaningful. The natural flow of spiritual practice contrasted sharply with the rigid timing that had governed every aspect of military life. Sacred time belonged to individuals rather than institutions. Captain Morrison shared stories of medical missionaries who had served in Asia before the war, describing doctors who treated patients regardless of nationality or political affiliation. His respect for these physicians revealed American traditions of service that transcended national boundaries, healing work that answered to higher authorities than government commands. As winter approached, the shrine in the recreation hall had grown to include offerings from multiple traditions. Flowers from the garden, stones arranged in meaningful patterns, small wooden carvings created in the workshop. The collaborative nature of the sacred space reflected the spiritual community that had emerged within the camp's boundaries, diverse yet unified in its commitment to hope. Individual recognition began with the smallest gestures. Captain Morrison started calling Keiko by name during medical rounds rather than using prisoner numbers or generic designations. The sound of her own name, spoken with respect, carried weight she had not anticipated. In military service, identity had been subsumed into function, personal characteristics irrelevant, except as they served collective objectives. Here, she existed as a specific person with unique knowledge and valuable perspectives. Sachiko received personal mail addressed to her full name rather than prisoner identification codes. The envelope carried her identity across ocean distances, acknowledging her existence as an individual worthy of communication rather than a faceless enemy, deserving only numbers. American postal workers had handled her correspondence with the same care they showed letters to their own family members. Guard shifts began, including informal conversations where Americans asked about Japanese customs, family traditions, personal interests that had nothing to do with military intelligence. Corpsman Davis inquired about Yuki's piano training, genuinely curious about musical education in Japan rather than seeking information that might advantage American forces. These exchanges treated prisoners as sources of cultural knowledge rather than strategic intelligence. The camp's record-keeping system maintained detailed files about each woman's skills, preferences, and individual needs. Emiko's expertise in supply logistics was noted and utilized in organizing camp resources. Keiko's medical specializations were documented and referenced when relevant cases arose. Their capabilities were recognized and valued, rather than suppressed or ignored. Personal property became another marker of individual recognition. Women were allowed to keep items that held sentimental value despite having no practical utility. Sachiko treasured a small photograph of her children that guards could have confiscated but chose to respect. These possessions acknowledged that prisoners had lives and relationships beyond their current circumstances. Work assignments reflected individual strengths rather than arbitrary distribution of labor. Yuki's musical abilities led to responsibilities organizing evening entertainment. Emiko's organizational skills were applied to managing camp supplies. Each woman found herself valued for specific talents that made her irreplaceable rather than interchangeable with others. Mealtimes evolved to accommodate personal dietary restrictions and preferences. Women who had difficulty digesting certain foods received alternatives without having to justify their needs or prove medical necessity. These accommodations treated individual comfort as worthy of consideration rather than a relevant luxury that prisoners should endure without complaint. Medical care addressed personal concerns that went beyond immediate health threats. Captain Morrison listened carefully when Keiko described headaches caused by stress rather than injury, providing treatment for conditions that affected quality of life rather than only survival. Patient care acknowledged psychological as well as physical well-being. Evening conversations increasingly focused on individual dreams and aspirations that extended beyond the war's conclusion. Women shared plans for post-conflict lives that assumed they would survive captivity and return to meaningful existence. Americans encouraged these discussions, treating prisoner futures as worthy of consideration and support. The most profound shift occurred in daily interactions where guards and staff consistently treated prisoners as people deserving basic courtesy. Please and thank you became routine parts of conversation. Requests were made rather than orders given when circumstances permitted choice. Common politeness replaced the harsh efficiency that military situations typically demanded. Personal space was respected within the constraints of security requirements. Women could arrange their bunks according to individual preferences, decorate small areas with personal items, create private spaces for reflection or correspondence. These freedoms acknowledged that even prisoners retained some right to control their immediate environment. Recognition extended to intellectual capabilities that had been dismissed or underutilized during military service. Keiko found herself consulted on medical questions that challenged her knowledge and skills. Her opinions carried weight in decisions that affected patient care, her expertise valued regardless of her status as an enemy prisoner. As winter deepened, each woman had established individual identity within the camp community. They were known by name, recognized for unique contributions, valued as specific people rather than generic representatives of enemy forces. This recognition of individual worth represented a fundamental challenge to everything military training had taught about dehumanizing adversaries. The reports arrived through official channels that prisoners were never meant to see, yet whispered conversations carried fragments of devastating truth. Allied prisoners in Japanese camps were dying at rates that approached 30%, their bodies wasting from starvation and disease while forced labor consumed what strength remained. The systematic brutality was documented in intelligence briefings that painted pictures of methodical dehumanization. Keiko overheard Captain Morrison discussing casualty statistics with another officer, their voices carrying horror at conditions that military doctrine considered acceptable treatment of captured enemies. American prisoners were worked to death in mines and jungles, their spirits crushed through deliberate cruelty that served no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating Japanese superiority over defeated foes. The contrast with their own experience created cognitive dissonance that some women could not resolve. While they gained weight on 3 abundant meals daily, Allied prisoners survived on rice portions so small that men weighing 200 pounds diminished to skeletal figures barely able to stand. Medical care that Japanese doctrine deemed unnecessary luxury resulted in death rates that shocked even hardened military observers. Sachiko struggled with guilt that her comfort came while American soldiers suffered tortures she could barely imagine. Her letters from home described rationing so severe that her children ate bark to dull hunger pains. Yet here she enjoyed foods that had vanished from Japanese tables years ago. The mathematics of survival had been inverted in ways that challenged basic assumptions about justice and fairness. Intelligence reports described Japanese facilities where prisoners received beatings for minor infractions. Medical care was withheld as punishment, and death was welcomed as escape from conditions that made survival a form of torture. Camp commanders took pride in mortality rates that demonstrated their commitment to showing no mercy toward enemies who had dishonored themselves through surrender. Yuki learned through overheard conversations that American pilots shot down over Japan faced immediate execution rather than imprisonment. Their bodies were displayed as trophies, their deaths celebrated as righteous punishment for bringing war to Japanese soil. The contrast with her own treatment, where musical talents were encouraged and cultural exchange was welcomed, created moral vertigo that left her questioning fundamental beliefs. Captain Morrison confided to Keiko during medical rounds that reports from Japanese prisoner facilities had influenced American policies toward captured enemies. The deliberate choice to treat prisoners with dignity represented strategic calculation as well as moral conviction. Intelligence flowed more easily from lips unbroken by torture. Cooperation came more readily from those who felt debt to repay kindness received. The paradox deepened as winter progressed. While Keiko worked in a well-equipped infirmary, treating minor ailments with abundant supplies, American medical personnel in Japanese camps watched patients die from diseases easily treatable with resources that enemy doctrine withheld. The professional contrast struck her medical training with particular force. Emiko discovered through camp newspapers that survival rates for Allied prisoners had reached crisis levels that threatened post-war prosecution for war crimes. Japanese commanders who viewed prisoner death as proof of proper discipline would face tribunals for systematic violation of international agreements their government had signed but never intended to honor. Evening discussions among the women increasingly focused on questions that had no comfortable answers. How could their own people treat enemies with such calculated cruelty while their captors provided better care than their own government had offered? What did survival and comfort mean when others died in misery for identical crimes of military defeat? The most troubling realization was that their treatment represented American strength rather than weakness. Nations secure in their values could afford mercy toward defeated enemies. Countries confident in their cause could demonstrate compassion without fear that kindness would be mistaken for vulnerability. The brutal efficiency that Japanese doctrine demanded revealed insecurity masked as superiority. As reports continued filtering through official channels, the contrast between captivity experiences became impossible to ignore. Paradise had emerged from prison, while hell was created from captured allies suffering under Japanese control. The reversal challenged every assumption about national character and military virtue that had shaped their understanding of this war and their place within its broader context. The transformation was not loud. It came in glances, in quiet confessions, in the way the women began to carry themselves throughout the Stockton compound. Keiko noticed that she no longer hunched with shame when guards passed, instead meeting their eyes cautiously while acknowledging shared humanity across the artificial divide of war. The change was subtle yet revolutionary, challenging years of conditioning that had taught her to make herself invisible in the presence of authority. Sachiko began eating openly rather than hiding food in pockets, no longer fearing that meals would be snatched away as cruel jokes. Her posture straightened during conversations with guards, her voice gaining strength as she realized that questions were welcomed rather than punished. The defensive crouch that military service had ingrained gradually dissolved under consistent treatment that valued her input and respected her dignity. Yuki's evening piano performances had evolved into confident presentations rather than tentative offerings. She selected pieces based on artistic merit rather than safety, sharing music that expressed personal emotions instead of approved sentiments. Her relationship with creative expression reflected broader changes in how she understood the boundaries between individual desire and collective obligation. Questions began emerging that had been unthinkable months earlier. If Americans were not demons, what else had been deliberate deception? If capture was not ultimate dishonor, what then constituted true shame? If enemies could demonstrate compassion, what did that reveal about the character of supposed allies? These inquiries rippled through conversations, whispered in darkness, scribbled in letters that would trouble censors on both sides. Emiko started planning post-war activities that assumed survival and meaningful future rather than death in captivity or execution upon return to Japan. Her discussions with other prisoners focused on dreams that extended beyond military service, personal aspirations that had nothing to do with empire or conquest. The shift from resignation to hope represented fundamental change in how she envisioned her place in a world beyond conflict. The most dangerous transformation occurred in their understanding of worth itself. Captain Morrison's consistent respect for Keiko's medical knowledge had convinced her that value existed independent of service to state objectives. Her expertise mattered because it helped people, not because it advanced strategic goals. This recognition of intrinsic worth challenged everything military training had taught about measuring human significance. Some women struggled with implications that extended far beyond their personal experience. If American kindness was genuine rather than strategic deception, what did that suggest about Japanese propaganda that demanded hatred of all foreign influences? If individual dignity could transcend national boundaries, what did that mean for concepts of racial superiority that justified conquest and occupation? Evening conversations increasingly challenged assumptions that had seemed unquestionable before captivity. Women debated whether loyalty required blind obedience or informed choice, whether honor meant following orders regardless of consequences or acting according to conscience when commands violated basic humanity. These discussions would have been treasonous in any official context. Corpsman Davis shared photographs of his family with natural affection that contradicted every description of American character that Japanese education had provided. His obvious love for wife and daughter revealed emotional depth that enemy stereotypes had denied, demonstrating humanity that transcended political divisions created by governments rather than peoples. The revolution was internal rather than external, psychological rather than political. Women who had accepted their own expendability now believed they deserved consideration and care. Prisoners who had expected brutality discovered that mercy was possible even between nations committed to mutual destruction. The transformation challenged not just individual beliefs, but entire systems of thought that sustained warfare. Knowledge became a form of resistance against propaganda that depended on ignorance for its power. Each act of American kindness contradicted official narratives that justified hatred and dehumanization. Every moment of respect received became evidence against claims that enemies were inherently evil creatures deserving only destruction. As winter deepened into spring, the psychological earthquake continued spreading through minds that had been carefully shaped by years of indoctrination. The foundation of beliefs that had supported their understanding of war and peace, loyalty and betrayal, honor and shame, was cracking under the weight of daily experiences that refused to conform to expected patterns. The war ended not with dramatic announcements, but with gradual changes in routine that suggested larger transformations beyond the Stockton compound. Guards spoke more freely about home, their conversations carrying anticipation rather than the grim determination that had characterized earlier months. Captain Morrison began discussing post-conflict medical cooperation between former enemies, his vision extending beyond immediate military necessities toward healing that transcended national boundaries. Keiko carried the memory quietly, yet it colored everything. When she walked through rebuilding streets, when she watched occupation soldiers distribute supplies to hungry children, when she held her sister's hand during long conversations about survival and hope, she remembered the camp not as prison, but as a strange, paradoxical paradise where humanity had emerged from the ashes of hatred. The transformation had been permanent. Years later, when historians interviewed former prisoners from Stockton, their words carried identical astonishment that had marked their daily experience. One recalled the chocolate that guards had shared, disbelief that enemies would offer sweetness without expecting payment, and suffering. Another described learning English phrases that express gratitude rather than surrender, communication that built bridges instead of emphasizing defeat. Sachiko returned to Tokyo, carrying letters from American soldiers to their families, messages of friendship that contradicted every propaganda portrait of heartless invaders. Her testimony about prison camp conditions created confusion among officials who had built strategies on assumptions of American brutality that her experience systematically contradicted. The mathematics of suffering had been reversed in ways that challenged fundamental beliefs about national character. The objects they carried home became symbols of truth larger than individual experience. Yuki's sheet music, annotated with English translations, represented cultural exchange that survived political division. Emiko's gardening notes, written in mixed languages, documented cooperation that transcended artificial boundaries created by governments rather than peoples. These artifacts testified to possibilities that official narratives had declared impossible. Some women struggled with guilt that their survival came through enemy kindness, while their countrymen had suffered systematic brutality in facilities that demonstrated Japanese military doctrine. Others questioned whether their treatment represented American weakness or strength, ultimately concluding that nations secure in their values could afford mercy toward defeated adversaries without fearing that compassion would be mistaken for vulnerability. The most profound legacy was not material, but psychological. Captain Morrison's respect for Keiko's medical knowledge had convinced her that worth existed independent of service to state objectives. Corpsman Davis's obvious love for his family had revealed emotional depth that enemy stereotypes had denied. Chaplain Brooks's gentle spiritual guidance had demonstrated that faith could offer comfort without demanding conversion or abandoning existing beliefs. Their testimonies, fragile yet powerful, formed a mosaic of experiences that defied simple narratives required by propaganda. The quiet revolution of dignity had not toppled governments, but it had shifted individual lives in ways that rippled through families, communities, and eventually nations. Understanding that enemies could choose mercy over vengeance became knowledge that could not be erased or forgotten. Decades after liberation, the women continued carrying questions that had emerged during captivity. If paradise could exist inside prison, what did that suggest about the nature of freedom itself? If opponents could demonstrate more concern for their welfare than their own commanders had shown, what did that reveal about loyalty and betrayal? If dignity could bloom in the hands of supposed foes, what possibilities existed for peace between peoples whose governments demanded mutual hatred? The Americans may not have intended to spark transformation through their policies of humane treatment. Their decisions were pragmatic, rooted in Geneva Convention obligations and strategic thinking about intelligence gathering. Yet the unintended consequence was revelation that kindness could win battles no weapon ever could, that treating enemies as human beings worthy of basic respect could achieve victory more complete than any military conquest. And so the story lingered not in official histories, but in quiet memories, in subtle changes these women brought to their families, in testimony that suggested alternatives to cycles of vengeance that had defined international relations. The greatest shock was not that Americans had treated them kindly, but that kindness itself could survive a world devoted to destruction.